there's a strange paradox in the flow of human religion. The purest and most insightful teachings are often obscured by humanity's own reverence. Buddhism is no exception to this rule. Initially, it was not a religion with rituals, deities, or dogma, but a path that pointed directly to the reality of suffering, guiding people toward liberation in this very life. However, just a few centuries after the Buddha's passing, the Dharma gradually adopted the trappings of a complete religious system, with solemn ceremonies, beliefs in seeking blessings, and concepts of heaven and hell. The most notable thing is that this distortion didn't come from an external force, but from within humanity's own insecure minds. People are inherently afraid of impermanence, unable to bear the fragility of life, and therefore crave an eternal anchor. When they lacked the capacity to live with the spirit of non-self, they constructed the image of a divine Buddha to lean on. When they didn't have the courage to face their own suffering, they built systems of belief, hoping that a divine being would save them. And layer by layer, the Buddha of wisdom and freedom was shrouded in mythology, rituals, and beliefs, heavily influenced by Brahmanism. Today, this reality is evident in spiritual life. People go to pagodas to chant for blessings, make pilgrimages to accumulate merit, burn joss paper to liberate the spirits of the deceased, and perform rituals to avert bad luck. They believe in karmic debt and the protective power of deities, without realizing that most of these things are a continuation of ancient Brahmanical beliefs, rather than the path to liberation that the Buddha originally opened. Everything seems to make sense. There are pagodas, monks, sutras, ceremonies, precepts, and doctrines. But when you look deeper, you see that many people are practicing Buddhism as a faith-based religion, rather than walking the path of seeing the truth clearly. The Dharma was originally a path to the cessation of suffering, but when it is transformed into a tool for petitioning, asking for blessings, and accumulating merit, it becomes an object that nourishes greed, anger, and delusion. The very things the Buddha taught his whole life must be overcome. This is no longer the Dharma, it's just another loop of the ego. A spiritual cycle, a cycle of the very idea of enlightenment. There are many people who have dedicated their lives to practice, taking vows, chanting, going on pilgrimages, and giving alms, yet deep down they are still full of suffering, fear, and craving. It's not that they are wrong, but perhaps they have never been pointed directly to the fundamental teaching that the Buddha originally gave. Once the very root is mistaken, the path, no matter how seemingly lofty, is just another closed loop. The journey to rediscover the original essence is not a rebellion against tradition, nor is it a complete negation of history. It is a radical honesty, a willingness to ask, are the things I believe, practice, and call Buddhism truly what the Buddha taught? Or are they just what I was taught about the Buddha? That question is the starting point. If you dare to face it to the very end, the true path to enlightenment can begin right there. To understand why the Buddha's teachings were mixed and distorted, we cannot ignore the context of ancient India, where religion was not just a personal belief, but a massive social system that influenced everything from daily life to political power. Before the time of the Buddha, the Brahmin caste held complete spiritual authority. They were seen as the bridge between humans and deities, holding a monopoly on performing sacrificial rituals, interpreting the Vedas, and defining the concepts of reincarnation, karma, and liberation. In the Brahmanical worldview, the universe was divided into many heavens and realms. Humans were believed to have an immortal soul, Atman, that drifted in the cycle of reincarnation. Every action, no matter how small, left a karmic imprint that influenced the next life. To escape this cycle, individuals had to perform complex sacrificial rituals under the guidance of the Brahmins, as a kind of passport to get closer to uniting with Brahman, the cosmic soul. This was not just a religious belief, but also a mechanism to maintain power for the ruling class. In this context, the appearance of the Buddha was an unprecedented spiritual revolution. He didn't just critique the system, he struck directly at its core foundation. He denied the existence of a permanent soul, rejected the effectiveness of all sacrificial rituals, and denied the spiritual authority of any caste. The Buddha declared, liberation is not in the hands of deities or rituals, but can only come from awakening within oneself, from seeing suffering clearly, the cause of suffering, and the path to ending suffering. This was nothing short of a counter-revolution of the era. A prince gave up his golden palace and also the system of beliefs that had dominated for thousands of years to live in the forest, meditate, and then say to people, no one can save you. No deity can grant you grace. No sacrifice can lead you to nirvana. Only you, by seeing the nature of suffering, can end it. It's important to imagine that this teaching not only shook the religious world, but also challenged the social system. Because if people didn't need rituals, didn't need Brahmins, and didn't need deities, the entire power structure based on those beliefs would collapse. This is the key point to understanding why the Buddha's teachings, though they initially shone like a torch, later had to adapt and blend with the very system they had once denied. After the Buddha's passing, his disciples continued to preserve and transmit the Dharma. However, about 200 years later, when the Mauryan dynasty rose to power, especially under the patronage of King Ashoka, Buddhism began a new phase. From a simple spiritual movement to an organized religion. King Ashoka, after experiencing the horror of bloody conquests, chose Buddhism as the moral foundation to unify his nation. This patronage allowed the Dharma to spread widely across the Indian subcontinent and beyond its borders. But it was at this very moment that a silent process of institutionalization took place. When Buddhism became a state religion, it no longer only faced sincere practitioners in deep forests, but had to engage with the general public who had lived for thousands of years within the Brahmanical ideological system. To make the teachings easier to propagate, many monks were forced to reuse familiar concepts: heaven, hell, reincarnating souls, and ceremonial offerings. The Dharma, which had originally broken down divine symbols, now had to take on those very symbols to become easy to understand and accessible to the populace. Gradually, non-Buddhist elements seeped in and shaped Buddhist culture. The concept of the reincarnating soul, originally rejected by the Buddha, was reused, with only the terminology changed to align with the new spirit. Rituals for deceased spirits, rebirth, and averting bad luck, which originated from Brahmanism and folk beliefs, were brought into pagodas, dressed in a Buddhist robe. The figure of the Buddha, from a human who had seen the truth, was mythologized into a supernatural being, possessing 32 auspicious signs, a shining aura, and the ability to manifest throughout the universe. This didn't happen overnight, but was the result of hundreds of years of compromise. The generations of monastics didn't intentionally distort the teachings. They simply wanted the Dharma to be more accessible and widespread. They were like parents who, when explaining something to a child, might use the image of the man in the sky. But if no one corrects the child, that child grows up believing there really is a man in the sky. In the same way, a new form of Buddhism emerged. A Buddhism of rituals, beliefs, and external forms. From a cultural perspective, this transformation might be acceptable because it helped Buddhism adapt and survive in various societies. But from the perspective of a truth seeker, this is a tragedy. The path to enlightenment was obscured by a layer of beliefs. People sincerely followed the Buddha, but got lost in a forest of superstitions created by society itself. If we don't understand this historical process, it's very easy to confuse the original essence with the layers added later. And in that confusion, liberation becomes a vague prospect, while the ego is further nourished. If there is one most critical point that distinguishes original Buddhism from Brahmanism, it is the doctrine of non-self, anatta. While Brahmanism asserted that every person has an immortal soul, Atman, which is identical to the cosmic soul, Brahman. The Buddha declared, "There is no soul. What we call I or mine is only the temporary combination of the five aggregates, skandhas, form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. They arise, exist for a moment, and then cease, with no eternal entity behind them pulling the strings." In the Anatalakkhana Sutta, the discourse on the characteristic of non-self, the Buddha taught the five monks. Form is non-self, feeling is non-self, perception is non-self, mental formations are non-self, consciousness is non-self. He analyzed each aggregate saying, what is impermanent is suffering. What is suffering cannot be considered a self. Thus, the entire thing we call a person is just a flow of change with no unchanging core. But people have always found this truth difficult to accept. The I, the ego, wants to be permanent. The mind always craves something immortal to cling to. Therefore, even though the doctrine of non-self was taught very clearly, many people still try to reinterpret it in a more comfortable way. That there is a subtle soul, a true self, that still exists after death. Some later scriptures even reintegrated the concept of the soul in the form of Buddha nature, or the undying true mind, making it easy for practitioners to mistakenly believe that Buddhism also recognizes a permanent self. To clarify, the Buddha used the example of a candle. When one candle is lit from another, does the first flame transfer over? No. It's just that when one condition ceases, another arises. The stream of consciousness is the same. No fixed entity reincarnates, only a chain of causes and conditions that continues without interruption. But people still prefer to imagine a soul that travels from one life to the next, because that helps them feel less disoriented in the face of death. Even in modern times, many who come to Buddhism actually still believe in some form of soul, just with a different name. They think the spirits of their deceased loved ones are still lingering, needing to be offered to for liberation. They believe an immortal part of themselves will be reborn in a good realm. This is a sign that it is difficult for people to escape from clinging to the ego. And as long as non-self is not seen, all spiritual practices, no matter how lofty their name, are just subtle efforts to maintain the self in new forms. As Buddhism spread within Indian society, it could not retain its initial simplicity. The people were accustomed to living in a Brahmanical atmosphere of belief, where every life event, birth, marriage, death, harvest, illness, was linked to ceremonial offerings. Therefore, when they came into contact with Buddhism, they brought those habits with them and unconsciously integrated them into pagoda activities. Gradually, a system of Buddhism-flavored rituals formed, ceremonies to avert bad luck, pray for peace, or offer prayers for the deceased, and even rituals for wealth and good fortune, which had their roots in Brahmanism or folk beliefs, were adopted by pagodas to meet the needs of the masses. Buddha statues were worshipped as deities. Bowing and chanting became a form of spiritual transaction. People made offerings, and in return, hoped to receive blessings, health, and peace. This process did not only happen in India, but was repeated every time Buddhism reached a new land. In China, Buddhism harmonized with Taoism and ancestral worship, creating a form of Buddhism with a strong folk character. In Japan, Buddhism blended with native Shinto beliefs. In Vietnam, Buddhism integrated with ancestor worship, rituals for wandering souls, and end-of-year ceremonies to avert bad luck. Wherever it went, Buddhism soaked into the local culture and was simultaneously transformed by that culture. From a sociological perspective, this is understandable. For a religion to survive, it must adapt, but from the perspective of enlightenment, this is a major deviation. The Buddha once emphasized, all rituals, no matter how solemn, cannot liberate people from suffering. A sick person gets well by taking medicine. no one can escape a fever by just praying. But it seems most people are not strong enough to follow that direct path. They choose the easier way, believing that as long as they perform rituals and make offerings, everything will be well. It is from this point that the image of the Dharma becomes contradictory. On one side is the original teaching, which calls for people to see clearly impermanence, non-self, and dependent origination. On the other is the widespread practice among the populace, which is tied to prayer, offerings, and the desire for merit. People go to pagodas, chant sutras, and perform ceremonies, but deep down, it's just to satisfy their need for peace of mind, not for enlightenment. And so, the path of liberation gradually became the path of seeking blessings, and the Dharma was slowly assimilated into one belief among countless others. One of the most noticeable transformations in the historical process of Buddhism is the mythologization of the Buddha, originally a human being of flesh and blood, into a supernatural figure. In the earliest scriptures, the image of the Buddha is very simple: a barefoot master, carrying his alms bowl, living in forests or simple huts, teaching people how to look directly at suffering to transcend it. But just a few centuries later, in the Mahayana scriptures, that image was shrouded in countless myths. The Buddha was described as having 32 major and 80 minor auspicious characteristics, with a radiating aura that lit up the 10 directions. He could manifest everywhere, knew everything in the universe, and had the power to save sentient beings with supernatural abilities. From there, a series of other Buddhas and Bodhisattvas were born. Amitabha Buddha in the West, Medicine Buddha in the East, Avalokiteshvara who saves from suffering and distress, and Ksitigarbha who oversees hell. Initially, these may have been symbolic representations, helping students visualize the vastness of wisdom, compassion, and vows. But over time, the public took them literally. Amitabha Buddha truly exists, with a Western Pure Land. Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara truly listens to all pleas to grant blessings. Ksitigarbha truly saves spirits in hell. And so, the Buddha, the one who pointed the way, was transformed into an omnipotent deity, with the power to bestow blessings and inflict harm. This brings about a profound paradox. The Buddha spent his life emphasizing, "I am only the one who shows the way. You must walk the path yourselves." But when he was mythologized, he became the one who takes us to a safe place. A completely contradictory image. From there, Buddhism was pulled back into the orbit of faith-based religions. People prayed to an external force for salvation, instead of contemplating on their own to achieve enlightenment. Of course, this mythologization also had historical reasons. In a society accustomed to believing in deities, the image of a Buddha who was just a human might not have been compelling enough to move the masses. For Buddhism to spread, the scriptures had to be infused with mythological elements. But the price to be paid was the obscuring of the original essence. Later generations, instead of seeing the Buddha as a role model of awakening to emulate, saw him as a deity to kneel before and pray to. If we don't recognize this change, it's easy to confuse belief with wisdom, prayer with practice, and myth with truth. And at that point, the path to liberation is just a story to be told, not a living reality to be walked. One of the most distorted concepts in Buddhism is nirvana. In the original teachings, nirvana was not a place, not a realm to be attained after death. Nirvana was simply the state of mind where all craving, anger, and delusion had been completely extinguished. The Buddha compared nirvana to a fire that has gone out. It doesn't go anywhere, it simply ceases. Nirvana does not belong to the past or the future, but can be experienced in the present moment, in the instant the mind lets go of all clinging at the root. However, for most people, this concept was too difficult to accept. They wanted a tangible reward, a permanently safe place after death. And so, nirvana was gradually transformed into a metaphysical realm, an eternal paradise. In Mahayana Buddhism, nirvana is sometimes identified with the Pure Land of Amitabha, Buddha, where the deceased are reborn to enjoy endless happiness. In some other traditions, nirvana became a divine realm, where the soul unites with ultimate reality, with the undying Buddha nature. While this transformation satisfied the public's need for spiritual comfort, it simultaneously lost the revolutionary nature of the original teaching. Nirvana did not promise a reward far away, but invited people to look directly at reality. Right now, if you see impermanence, non-self, and dependent origination clearly, suffering can cease. But when nirvana was pushed into being a metaphysical realm, it became an object of craving, a hope to cling to, and therefore nourished the very craving that the Buddha wanted to extinguish. The paradox lies in this: the more one craves nirvana as a future realm, the further one is from true nirvana. For nirvana is not something to be possessed, but the cessation of all desire to possess. Nirvana is not a reward, but the complete letting go of the belief in rewards. Nirvana is not immortal existence, but liberation from the craving for immortality. Realizing this is a crucial turning point. It brings us back to the original essence. Nirvana is not in a book, not in some other world, but is the stillness of the mind, right when there is no more clinging. Along with nirvana, the concept of reincarnation, samsara, is another point that has been deeply distorted in Buddhist history. In the Brahmanical context, samsara was understood as the rebirth of an immortal soul, Atman, through many different lives, governed by karma, until it attained liberation and united with Brahman. The Buddha, upon his appearance, retained the term reincarnation to dialogue with the society of his time, but he radically changed its core meaning. According to the Buddha, there is no soul or self that reincarnates. There is only a stream of causes and conditions that continues, a continuous chain of arising conditions, like the flame from one candle lighting another. The fire does not transfer from one place to another. It only exists when the conditions are right. Similarly, rebirth does not require a fixed entity to travel from one life to the next. There is only cause and effect, dependent origination. But there is no one who reincarnates. However, this truth was too difficult for the human mind, which fears death, to accept. People need to believe that some part of them, a soul, a consciousness, will continue to live after the body decays. And so, over time, reincarnation in Buddhism was gradually understood in the exact same way as in Brahmanism. A subtle self that goes through many lives, sowing karma and reaping its results. Many practitioners, even monastics, have taught it this way. From there, countless rituals for the deceased, for liberating spirits, and for merit transference to departed souls were created. People believed that a real soul was suffering in the realm of hungry ghosts or hell, and needed assistance from the living. This, while offering comfort to relatives, contradicts the fundamental teaching of non-self. It nourishes the belief in an immortal me, the ego, instead of breaking it down. The Buddha taught about reincarnation not for people to cling to the idea of a next life, but for them to see clearly in the present moment. In every instant, greed, anger, and delusion arise and cease, forming a cycle of mental existence. Each time we cling to an idea, we are reborn into it. Each time we get angry, we have been born into a world full of angry fire. Each time we are deluded, we are living in a dark realm. True reincarnation is not far away. It happens in every single moment of the present. If this is understood, reincarnation is no longer a metaphysical myth, but a living reality to be observed and transcended. But if the misunderstanding continues, reincarnation will only be a mythological story that feeds more fear and the desire for immortality. Another pillar of Buddhism that has been transformed over time is the concept of karma. In the original teachings, karma was simply intentional action. Every thought, word, and deed leaves an imprint, creating the conditions for corresponding results in the present and future. Karma is not a judgment, not written down by anyone, and there is no deity who sits in judgment. It is simply the natural operation of cause and effect. What seed you sow and how the soil, water, sun, and wind affect it is what will determine the fruit that grows. However, over time, karma was misunderstood as a kind of cosmic law of justice, with a nature of reward and punishment. People believed that a supernatural force was keeping a record of everything, and then deciding whether we would encounter good fortune or misfortune, and whether our next life would be in heaven or hell. This interpretation, which originated from the Brahmanical system of divine authority, seeped back into Buddhism, turning karma into a tool to comfort or intimidate the masses. For example, when someone experiences misfortune, people often say, "That's the karmic result from a previous life." When someone succeeds, it's explained as, "That's thanks to the merit they've accumulated." This way of speaking makes karma seem like a fixed destiny, and people become resigned, less able to see the freedom that exists in the present moment. In contrast, the Buddha always emphasized, karma does not bind anyone forever. As soon as you awaken, new actions can be created, and those new actions will open up a new path. The important thing is to understand that karma is not for us to sit in judgment of ourselves or others, but for us to see the clear link of cause and effect in every moment of life. When we are angry, the consequence is immediate unease. When we are compassionate, the consequence is immediate lightness. That is karma in reality. You don't need to wait for a next life. But if we transform karma into a metaphysical law of reward and punishment, we fall back into the cycle of superstition, making offerings to change karma, performing rituals to clear karma, when in fact karma can only be transformed by our own awareness and wise action. Seeing it this way, we can see the clear difference. Karma is not a judgment, but an opportunity. Karma is not a chain that binds, but a door that opens to the path of liberation, if we know how to stop and act with wisdom. Looking back at the entire process, we can clearly see a trajectory. From a simple spiritual revolution initiated by the Buddha, Buddhism was gradually reshaped into a religion with rituals, myths, a system of beliefs, and social institutions. This process both helped Buddhism survive and caused it to lose its original essence. On a social level, this transformation has a justifiable reason. Ordinary people find it difficult to live by awakened wisdom alone. They need belief, rituals, community, and specific forms to lean on. A pagoda with the sound of bells and wooden fish drums, with solemn Buddha statues, and with vibrant festivals, can give them a sense of security, peace of mind, and belonging. The beliefs in merit, in good realms, and in Buddhas and Bodhisattvas can uplift their spirits and help them live more virtuously. Thanks to this, Buddhism was able to integrate into many cultures and become a part of human life. But on the level of enlightenment, this is a tragedy. Because the Buddha did not come to establish a religion, and certainly not to build a system of beliefs. He came to point out the truth. Suffering is present. The cause of suffering is greed, anger, and delusion. And if you see impermanence, non-self, and dependent origination clearly, suffering can cease in this very life. That path does not require rituals, does not require prayer, and does not require any intermediaries. It only requires a person who dares to look directly at themselves. Thus, two faces of Buddhism coexist. On one hand, there is the Buddhism of the populace, with pagodas, rituals, beliefs, and myths. And, on the other hand, there is the Buddhism of original wisdom, the path to liberation that the Buddha walked and pointed out. If a student of Buddhism is not mindful, they can easily get lost in the first phase, thinking it is the entirety of the religion, while neglecting the second phase, the only essence that has the ability to liberate. At this point, the big question is, what do we seek in Buddhism? If we only want a spiritual anchor, a religion for comfort, then faith-based Buddhism can fulfill that. But if we truly want enlightenment and to fundamentally escape suffering, then we must have the courage to step out of that shell and return to the original spirit, seeing reality as it is. Having seen the transformations and the layers of myth and ritual covering Buddhism, the natural question is, what is the path to return to the original essence? The answer, as the Buddha himself emphasized, lies in direct practice for each individual, not in belief or form. This essence is very simple: seeing the truth of suffering, impermanence, non-self, and dependent origination. You don't need to wait for a next life. You don't need a heavenly realm, and you don't need to pray to any divine power. Whenever craving, anger, or delusion arises in the mind, you only need to look directly at it, to see it arise and see it cease. In that moment, you escape the cycle of the mind. That is nirvana in the present, the extinguishing of the fire of craving. This doesn't require leaving daily life. The Buddha once taught, in this very fathom-long body, with its perceptions and thoughts, I declare there is the world, the arising of the world, and the cessation of the world. This means that all the secrets of birth and death, reincarnation and nirvana, can be seen right within this very body and mind, without needing to be found in any other realm. This path also doesn't demand blind faith. The Buddha didn't force anyone to believe in him, but advised them to experience it for themselves. Just as a person who tastes salt knows its saltiness for themselves. Faith, if it exists, is only a temporary belief to get started, and must be replaced by direct experience. If we understand this, we realize that returning to the essence of Buddhism doesn't mean rejecting pagodas, rituals, or scriptures. These things can still be useful as a means for the community and for culture. But a person who truly wants enlightenment doesn't stop there. They use these means to remind themselves, but always remember that the ultimate goal lies in contemplating impermanence and non-self, and in letting go of the ego at its root. That original path may be one that few dare to walk, because it promises no rewards and has no place for clinging. But for that very reason, it is truly liberating. And only in this way can we see the Buddha as he truly was. Not an omnipotent deity, but a human being who awakened and pointed the way for others to awaken as well.